Welcome to the second session of the day. It is International Women's Day, and we are here to speak about how we can affect cultural change in financial services. I would like to thank the panel for joining me today. So today we have Alison, Cottrell, CEO of Banking Standards Board. We have Michael Watkins, Head of Proposition Development for Smart Pensions and also co-founder and chair of Next Generation Pensions. And we have Debbie Gupta, co-director, Life Insurance and Financial Advice Supervision at the Financial Conduct Authority. This session is going to be live streamed, so welcome to anyone that's joining us online. And I would just like to remind you that you can ask questions on the app, as well as on the live chat bot, I think, if you're online. But also, we will make time for some questions at the end. You can also tweet about the session, if you're that way inclined, at the PLSA Invest 19 hashtag. So, today is International Women's Day. I know that there have been some fantastic statistics rolling on the screens outside, and we have touched on some of the elements today. But for the session today, I really wanted to focus on three main areas that International Women's Day really focuses on. One is celebrating the success of women. One is raising awareness against bias. And the third is taking action for equality. Obviously, today we are speaking in a broader context about diversity, more around cognitive diversity, not just about gender, even though that's very aware, tangible, and measurable, but also about background, about social background, demographics, educational, and also ethnicity. We're celebrating diversity in many ways already as an industry. We have multiple awards. The Women in Pensions Award has been flashing up quite a lot. We also have the Rising Star Awards. But we have many groups that are trying to raise awareness about diversity. We have the Diversity Project, which is very well known now. We indeed have the Next Generation group as well, which is raising awareness about the valuable younger individuals within the industry. But are we really raising awareness about the risks that are involved in not having enough diversity in the industry? We know through research that low levels of diversity in decision makers in banks and other financial institutions has actually led to an inhibition in cultural change, and also it's created excess risk, which is why you would see in the reference to the lack of diversity and has it affected the financial crisis in the introduction of this session. We understand that the lack of diversity is now used as an indicator by authorities about whether or not there is heightened cultural or behavioral risks in an organization. And that's because it creates groupthink, it creates overconfidence, it decreases effective debate, and it can stop effective decision-making. So this brings me to my first question for the panel, and I'll probably come straight to Alison, about how can we create the diversity and the cultural change that is needed? What actions can we take?
Let me start by just saying something about culture, and then just highlighting a couple of things that have come out of our work with the banking sector, but which I think do have read across to other parts of the financial services sector. I mean, when we talk about culture, you can define it in lots and lots of ways. I remember coming across a paper that was written back in the 50s that had, here's 160 definitions of culture, and there's probably a lot more that have come up in the 60 years since then. But think about it as the way that people behave in groups. And we know we behave very differently in different groups. It's the shared values, the shared assumptions. We were hearing in the previous session about some of the things that affect our behavior. And we may behave rationally, but behaving rationally doesn't always mean that we behave in a way that gets us to the best outcome. Because actually, as human beings, what we often care about is being liked, is being seen as sensible, as being seen as wise, as not letting colleagues down. And so we often go with the person that speaks first, or with the majority, or with the person that speaks loudest. So we want to conform to the group. And when we're in a firm, when we're in an organisation, when we're in an asset management firm, we want to go with the group of people around us. We want to fit in. Every firm will have its own culture. Every firm is completely different. Every organisation is completely different. And it will be a product of its leadership, its environment, the composition of its people, and its history. Every firm is going to be different. But if we think about a good culture and the culture that firms want to move towards as being a culture which is good for customers, for clients, for society, for the economy, a couple of the things that have come out of our work with banks, the Banking Standards Board, are, first of all, don't make it harder to do the right thing than it is to do the wrong thing. You know, keeping in mind that inclination that we all have towards norming with the group. Are the processes, are the systems, actually a remuneration in particular, aligned with the values? Things like speaking up, really hard for anyone to start with. Do the processes actually help that? Do they encourage it? And coming to our theme, diversity. We know that, again, as human beings, we can be really bad at recognizing our own mistakes. Actually, we're better often at recognizing other people's. If you surround everyone with people that look and are and think just like them, you make it even harder to recognize the mistakes that are happening around the group. And the second point is around role modeling. What comes over very strongly is the importance of leaders, of managers, of influencers, not just saying where they want to get to, you know, this is the culture we want to, this is how we get to it, but actually acting it. And let me just give you one example here. We have a question in the survey that we ask of banks, a statement, easy statement, agree, disagree, that asks about, is there a tension between here are the values of my firm and here is the way that my firm does business? And you get a whole range of views in answer to this question, which of themselves are quite interesting. Now, we also have focus groups of employees within the firms. And when you look at the focus groups in the areas of firms that answer very positively to that question, in other words, there isn't a gap between the values and the way we do business, and the focus groups drawn from the areas of firms that answer very poorly to that question, there are some differences that come out in what people say. And one of the differences is that among the firms that answer very strongly, when people talk about values in their firm, they talk about, I saw my manager do this, I saw my CEO do this, I saw my colleague do this. When you look at the transcripts of the focus groups in areas of firms that answer quite poorly, there are no names. There is just silence, because people don't automatically think this is what people in my group are doing. And you have to actually translate those values into the actions that people think of. They think of people doing those things.
Okay. So, Michael, do you think that there are enough role models within the industry that are affecting change and to look to for the younger generation?
I think that there are a number of very accomplished people in this industry who talk quite often about diversity. I think part of the issue is that diversity is treated in a vacuum. There isn't enough access to a diverse pool of people. For example, look around the auditorium today, I see lots of people that I know, and it's the same people that you see at every conference. And like I say, by giving people the access to come to conferences like this, give them the experience of being in rooms with esteemed colleagues, intelligent people, they can learn and then, positively affect people going forward.
And what sort of actions would you like to see more generally in the workplace that might create some further cultural change?
I think it's just about inclusivity. I think Alison and I were talking before, it's about the concept of bringing people along with you, making time for people, mentoring, again, was a subject that was spoken about on Friday evening. It seems that culture has kind of shifted a little bit. It seems more about senior management, but to get to a senior level, you have to understand the path that you need to take. You have to understand the mistakes that have been made before. So I'd like to see more of that. I'd like to see more mentoring going on within the industry. Share your mistakes, share your successes, but people need to learn from them. And that's the only way that this industry moves forward, because we have a tendency, again, to talk a lot about the change that we want to make without actually changing anything.
What do you think is one easy thing that people could do in order to facilitate change then? How should they be sharing ideas? How should they be helping the younger generation?
I would say be more open. I think there's a level of protectionism that happens, again, within this industry, and it's completely understandable. But at the same time, eventually, this industry won't be our industry, it'll be the next generation's industry. So help people up, I would just say, support and give as much time and energy as you can to other people. We're all incredibly busy, of course we are, but you make time for the things that you're passionate about.
And so, Debbie, we've sort of started to touch on some barriers to the cultural change. What do you think are the barriers to real change and effective change?
I think I'd probably highlight two in particular. The first is the nature of the debate about diversity. I think if we were honest, we would say there are an increasing number of passionate advocates for this agenda. There are a small minority of skeptics who will always be skeptics. But my suspicion is, and perhaps it includes many of you here, we're sort of signed up to it because we know we should, because it's sort of untenable now to not be on board. And I think that's subtly different to being bought in to the agenda, to really understanding and believing that this is absolutely integral to sustainable, long-term, successful business. And I think that's part of what the Financial Conduct Authority is beginning to explore in more detail. So, honesty about the debate that is less about perceptions of political correctness and what one ought to say, and honesty about what does that actually mean in practice for our business model, beginning to think about cognitive diversity. How does that impact innovation? How does that impact creativity? How does that impact our ability to think and anticipate the world in which we will continue to operate? So I think bringing some of this debate closer to home, perhaps, and being a bit more honest about it, would tackle one of the barriers. Fear, I think, is a kind of big barrier. Fear of talking about this agenda and fear of saying the wrong thing stifles that kind of debate. The second thing I'd point to is diversity, I think, has become a sort of a really important thing that we are all trying to measure. And they're really good indicators of culture. But in some cases, I observe people beginning to talk about those indicators as if they are outcomes in themselves. So we cite statistics as if we have achieved something. And actually, the thing we're trying to achieve in firms is a culture of openness, of the ability to speak up, and therefore to really value and hear different perspectives. And that's a subtly different thing to how many women have you got on your board, what is the demographic composition of your workforce. And those are important because in a way they're the only things we can tangibly use to give us an indication of whether we have a more open culture. But I don't think they get to the heart of the thing that I think we all recognise as a valuable, important part of a business model, which is an open culture. So I suppose the challenge for me would be, how do we begin to explore what the indicators of an open culture are that go beyond the demographic stats?
And also, I guess, how then organisations use that in their own culture, because it sounds, I think everyone's sort of agreeing, it's a top-down, bottom-up approach. You have to be having the right people saying the right thing within the organisation, but you need to be sending the right message down from the top as well. And in order, therefore, in the key decision-making roles, for us that might be within boards, we have to make sure that we have the right voices. But also then it does bring up the question of cultural change takes a long time. And therefore, it sounds like over time we will absolutely have a talent issue if this isn't dealt with, because the talent will go elsewhere. They won't want to work potentially in organisations where they don't feel that they have opportunity. But also, in the short term, does that mean that we just have to accept the increased risk level that potentially is coming from the lack of the change? Or are there other things that we could be doing in order to help facilitate that change in the short term? So I know a lot of the consultants have started doing, increasingly putting diversity within their review of boards and their effectiveness. Do we think that there's anything else that we could be doing in order to influence? Do we think that there are some key things that we should be looking for?
I think we could talk about the industry in a more positive manner. this industry isn't seen as sexy, but there's a lot of money in this industry which people do find sexy. So if we speak about it in a more positive light rather than sort of self-deprecating, I think there'll be more inclination for people to want to join this industry and make a change. I read a stat the other day that was something like 1 in 9 disruptors in any industry come from outside of the industry, which mean that the idea is you're coming at something from a completely fresh angle. But if you're getting new blood into the industry and they're not sort of tied to legacy ways of thinking, it can help improve things, create new jobs that are more interesting for people, perhaps. I don't know. It feels like there's more that we should be doing.
And it also comes back, I mean, Michael, you linked together words diversity and inclusion, which we tend to just bunch together and use as the same phrase, but they are very, very important complements. I mean, if we focus primarily on diversity because we want our businesses to look, the way that we're targeting them, but we don't get the inclusion bit, then you're not going to get effectively the wisdom of crowds, which is what we want in the organisation. We want people to be able to not just spot mistakes, as I mentioned, but say, actually, this is how we could do something better, this is a different perspective, this is a different customer view, or whatever. Which means that to have the wisdom of crowds, you need in the first place clearly to have a range of opinions and experiences, cognitive diversity, as you mentioned, Alison, and then you need the inclusive culture that not only allows people to voice those different views, but encourages them to voice those views and actually rewards them. And one of the things, again, that we talk about, the phrase that rolls off the tongue about the importance of speaking up, what we often find when we talk with employees, it's not just the sort of, are you frightened to speak up because of the consequences and things? Yes, that is a big issue. But an almost equal issue is people saying, well, actually, I'm not frightened of speaking up. There's no point because nothing happens when I do speak up. So that sort of mixture of fear and futility. And what organisations often do is they address the fear and they forget the futility. And if you want to really get the message over that, we welcome the speaking up, we want the different views, we want the challenge because we'd rather, find things before they become big things and actually keep continually improving, then you have to have that responsiveness angle. You have to have the listening, either listening up, listening down, whatever you want to call it. But I think increasingly we focus on the speaking bit, but the listening bit is the crucial side.
And I guess, so bringing it back, especially to pensions specifically, on our boards, we know that it is majority men. We have had some statistics, I think 80% are men. It's very important that we get the right mix of skills in order to represent the underlying member base. So in some circumstances, just to be extremely fair to people, that might be a representation of the underlying member base. But given the fact that I think over 50% of the population is now under 35, is there also an argument that just like Accenture are doing by bringing in Anna, etc., to their trustee board, is there something that we could do in order, I think this is the key thing, of what is going to make people make a change? At the moment, there's no reason to make that change unless a chairman or somebody on the board is trying to push for it. Do we think that there is something that we can do in order to accelerate change in some way, in order to make people more aware? And is there something that we can do that might be, helping?
I think, there's a sort of push and pull. Leadership is absolutely critical to ensuring that you have a workforce and a senior leadership team that's bought into the agenda. And I don't think, let's take the example of the regulator. The regulator can invent a whole load of rules that drive somehow cultural change, but in a sense it will absolutely miss the point. You can't codify culture. And in some senses, although quite understandably people push for the regulator to get into the space of, well, give me the checklist, give me the tick boxes that will help me understand whether I'm doing okay, I think the challenge is actually, no, this is about leadership, governance, and the way in which you manage risk. So they are, in a sense, the bread and butter of effective business practice. Now, I'm not sure you can find alternatives to that very core principle of leadership buy-in. If people don't accept it and understand it and celebrate it, then how do you effect change? I I would be really hard pushed to find ways to do that that don't have unintended consequences. I think it is leadership.
Yeah, so coming back to Michael then, so representing a group of next generation, right, next generation individuals, that's a vast array of not just younger individuals, but also those seeking to take a leadership position and being trained for that. What values do you think and what can they bring into boards? How can they help educate leaders into understanding the valuable contribution that they can give?
Well, I'd say I'm not a fan of change for the sake of change, nor positive discrimination. I think as a person in the world, you should always listen to other people because you have something else to learn, right? You can't possibly know everything. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you should have a young person that sat on a board because they're a young person. They might not have the knowledge or experience to be able to impart any change or positive effect. But it is about listening to people and hearing what they have to say just because they have a different perception. So to the point, I think there's a long journey ahead of us in terms of mentoring, giving people the preparation and access to skills, access to information, but also being prepared to listen and take on board what's being said, just because it comes from a different perspective. And like I said, it doesn't matter whether that's a young person or an older person or a woman or a man. Like it doesn't matter. It's about being prepared to listen to what other people have to say.
Mm-hmm. And Alison, do you think that boards or key decision makers, I think that's more important, do you think that they are listening? Do you think that they are aware of the risks and also potentially how they could make a change?
I think we probably struggle to find boards teams that wouldn't buy into the message of diversity. It's, as you say, it's translating it into practice. And I think, one of the sad things, if you think back 10 years, 20 years ago, we would probably be having quite a similar conversation in that change takes time and it will come, but you get another decade on and another decade on. Now, clearly society changes, the customer base changes, people change. But again, it's how do you get those different views in and how do you get a business environment where you're not just trying to hire in people of different views, but you actually retain them and they move up in the business. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't actually get, and it comes back to that diversity and inclusion mix, if you have the diversity bit in the hiring, but you don't have the inclusion bit in the way that the organisation runs, all you're going to find is that you have a turnover problem in parts of your business because you're bringing in smart people, but there isn't anywhere that they can actually utilise that smartness, and so they're going to go somewhere else. So as an organisation, I think, and I agree entirely, it comes back to the culture. It's not something that you can sort of put into a regulation or a code and say, therefore we have, a fabulously diverse sector. It makes business sense. It makes business sense. There is a real role here for non-execs, mm-hmm. Because actually the board should be demonstrating their diversity. They are bringing diverse views into the firm for the owners, for the shareholders, for the asset owners, for the employees. Actually, why would I want to join a firm which doesn't actually have people senior that look like me? So how do you don't have to move everyone at the same pace at the same time, but how do you start to shift that norm? Mm-hmm. And how do you say, this is because it is good for a sustainable business model? And the number of, the more directions we can get that message coming from, and just having people, employees are the best ambassadors. So how do we use them to say, actually, you want to come and work here because this is where you can really exercise your full potential?
So this sort of brings us therefore back to the measures, doesn't it? So if we are using indicators and, we're trying to measure maybe not cultural change, but because it's still something to come, but diversity, do we think that the measures are sending a positive enough message, number one? Do we think they're the right types of measurements? Because obviously, if at the moment what we've got is an industry whereby the measures are questionable, and then they also do tend to send a relatively negative message. We're not celebrating successes as well. So maybe a question for you, Debbie. Do you think that the measures are the right ones, and do you think we could celebrate success more?
I think the measures are a start. They're good indicators, but they are a start. And my biggest concern is we get complacent. We struggle enough with those indicators that they become ends in themselves. I think the use of identity as an indicator is problematic. Again, useful as a start, but there are umpteen numbers of ways in which you identify, and therefore the sort of I'll have one of each approach just kind of runs out of utility. So again, a useful beginning, but a beginning in terms of what I hope will be a more ambitious and more rich agenda. So in a way, moving away from identity. And I don't think we've even begun to scratch the surface of how do you measure inclusivity? How do you measure openness in a culture? And arguably, if you were able to do that effectively, diversity may well follow. And maybe we are chasing this the wrong way round. So in terms of open culture, to what extent, I hypothesize, do we think about grievances? Do we think about whistleblowing? Do we think about non-disclosure agreements? Do we think about the ways in which people feel they have to act and behave in order to progress because it's set as a norm within a firm's culture? And that, in a sense, acts as probably the biggest stifler of the benefits of diversity, because you're not allowing people to be different. I think one of the most interesting bits of research, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting it, but there's some work that's been done in the civil service where over a number of years they have really worked hard to move the dial on the composition of the workforce and the representation on identity terms, and they've done really well. But actually, with a bit more deeper research, what they found is, lo and behold, the workforce looks different, but they are all from Russell Group universities, they are all graduate intake, they are all behaving and conducting themselves in a way that is no different to what went before. And it's great that they have identified that as one of the issues around an open culture that they are trying to tackle. And that's why I worry that demographic indicators on their own may mean we miss the point.
Yeah, there are too many intangibles, I think. If you, just on the surface, as you were saying, you can judge somebody by which box they fit into. It doesn't define who they are, doesn't define how they think. You may look at me and see how I'm dressed and say, oh, he's a young rapscallion. I'm not, I'm 34. But it doesn't define who I am. Being a guy doesn't mean that I think the same way as every other guy. Being 34 doesn't mean I think the same way as every other 34-year-old. And I'm sure it's the same for many, if not every person in this audience. You're not defined by the box that you fit into. And that's ultimately what this is about. It's about cognitive diversity. And the metrics that we use, it's a start, but it doesn't really get us to where we need to get to.
So Alison, we spoke a bit earlier, didn't we, about how you're trying to measure or look into this problem. Do you want to just touch on that sort of thing?
Yes, and I think it's entirely because you can tick diversity boxes, but you're not actually measuring diversity. You're just ticking a box on something. And similarly, when it comes to culture, because just picking up on your point, I think, is diversity which is the tail, which is the dog here, and actually is the culture the key thing, or is it diversity? And I agree, I think actually the culture drives everything here. I don't think, personally, that you can measure culture, going back to this point that every group, but certainly every organisation will have its own culture. And to be frank, if you're an organisation, you've got more than one room, you might have more than one culture, so little cultures around the organisation. But the fact that you can't measure culture doesn't mean that you can't judge it or assess it. And in particular, it doesn't mean you can't manage it. You can't choose not to have a culture. So the only question is, are you going to manage it actively and try and create the one that you want to have in your organisation? So the approach we've taken in working with banks is to say there isn't a single measure of culture. There isn't a single good culture that everyone has to aspire to, because there can be lots of good ones and there can be lots of really bad ones. But coming back to this point as to what do we mean by a good culture, it's a culture that produces good outcomes for customers, for the pride and professionalism of employees, and for broader economy and society. Are there things that we can measure that we would expect on a common sense approach to be associated with good outcomes, in the sense that the firm would appear to have employees who are well motivated and well equipped to serve customers well? And so we've boiled this down to what we call 9 characteristics, things like honesty, reliability, competence, which Honora O'Neill, who is a very established moral philosopher who used to be on the Banking Standards Board, she defines honesty, reliability, competence as the basis of trustworthiness which is what we're trying to get at here. It's not about trust, it's is the company trustworthy? So things like honesty, reliability, competence, resilience, as in personal resilience, respect, responsiveness, openness, accountability, and shared purpose. And we take each of these characteristics and we try to get a measure of the extent to which employees see these characteristics as demonstrated around the firm. And we do this via surveys and various other means. And it allows firms to benchmark parts of their organisation against the same parts of a business in other organisations. So how is my risk and compliance area performing relative to other risk and compliance areas against these characteristics, against these questions? Very importantly, it doesn't give you one number. Mm-hmm. This is not a thing that can be done, you know, I've got that number, I'm okay, I've achieved that. It gives you quite a complex picture. And it's also a picture that firms then need to look at in the context of all of the other data they get internally, or absence rates, or whatever else, engagement surveys. And it's not something you ever finish, you know, but it's actually what sort of heat map, what sort of picture do you get, just so you know what's happening in your organisation. What we often find is that, and certainly we can probably think of this, you know, if we think of our own groups and our own firms, it's much easier to describe the culture that you want than it is sometimes to try and describe the culture that you have. And if you're going to change something, you need to know where you want to get to, but you need to know where your starting point is. And there's no perfect measure, but it doesn't mean you can't try.
Yeah, so I think coming to some of these questions as well, I'm going to try and tie it in. We've got a couple of people that seem to be asking, how do they approach diversity when making decisions about people to join boards, member-nominated trustees? You know, there seems to be quite a few questions about just how do I go about approaching this problem? So there needs
to see me.
Okay. There seems to be an awareness of the fact that there is a problem, but maybe because you can't maybe quantify it, how is it that you go about making sure that people have the right backgrounds, etc., how the mix and the composition should look, and what is really the starting point when the trustee board maybe is male-dominated? So, you know, there has to, as you say, there has to be a start, there has to be an end, possibly also bringing in consultants to help with this problem, but Michael, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, again, it's back to the cognitive diversity piece. You may well have, you know, an entirely male board, but it may actually be as diverse as they come. So I think...
Or appropriate.
Yeah, or appropriate. So it may be about looking beyond skill sets and, I mean, Myers-Briggs, or, you know, there are other measurements that you can use to test how the composition fits. And I think if we start looking at those metrics rather than the traditional how many years experience do you have. I mean, trustees are a really good example, because somebody was having this conversation with me the other day where they're saying, being a trustee for 20 years, and it's like, well, you may have been a trustee for 20 years, but do you have 20 years experience, or do you have 1 year's experience 20 years over? So there's a consideration there. It's not, experience isn't just a number. It's about what you're actually living, experiencing, and how many new things you're thinking about.
And the way in which you're thinking about those problems, especially in a world that's changing. I mean, the pensions market especially is very transitional right now. How we're thinking is going to be very important, or whether or not we're still stuck to a certain degree in the past. There are numerous questions here about reporting. So be that the gender pay gap reporting, as well as various other types. Is it actually driving cultural change? Do we expect to see a significant difference? You know, this is my point as well. Is it creating negativity in certain areas? Do we think it's valuable, or should we be looking at things in a slightly different way? Debbie?
Well, I think, again, the gender pay gap is a very interesting driver of change. And I think it's doing both of those things. I think in some firms it is absolutely they're asking themselves questions about how the picture looks, what it might want to be looking like in future. The most progressive companies, my observation is the most progressive companies are already beginning to think about how they might improve the picture that they've assessed, while others, perhaps quite a few, are explaining the picture that they have in a way that sort of enables them to justify historical trends, you know, the pool of talent from which there are limitations, all sorts of explanations, but at least they are surfacing as explanations that can be challenged and gripped. Does the gender pay gap also create some backlash and negativity. 100% it does, right? And that's what I mean by the debate needs to be had over and over again. If people are fearful of expressing concerns about the way in which there are unintended consequences from these initiatives, then we stifle the very richness of constantly reminding ourselves, as all good leaders do, why it's important.
And actually, just one sort of side comment on the gender pay gap, which is within organisations, it's so important to talk about this within the organisation.
Yeah.
You know, because you can get big difference between firms where they will actually, you know, talk either as the organisation, as sort of town hall or in management teams about this. And then you can have other firms where actually nothing's really said, nothing's drawn attention to it, or things are scheduled but they don't happen. And, you know, you get more of the negative approach within employees within the organisation, who are the people you want to retain, if actually it just seems to be being brushed under the carpet than if it's really seized, because people aren't stupid. You know, people can see where there's a problem. What they need to know is the firm recognising that there's a problem and intends to do something about it? It's always the forward-looking approach. What is going to change, not is where we came from. But, you know, the more it becomes a subject of discussion within the firm, the better.
So I think there are two questions that have caught my eye. I knew we weren't going to be able to have this session without a few people at least asking about negative discrimination against men. Do we think, therefore...
I think outnumbered in this...
Yes. Do we think that due to the lack of diversity, particularly known within our industry, that we're getting to the point that there is, very well qualified, I'm quoting, very well qualified white middle-aged males are being discriminated against because of the fact that we are favouring diversity?
I'll dive in first. As I said, I'm not a fan of positive discrimination. I don't think it's a case of you have this and you should change it to this. So I don't think that should happen at all. It's about balance. It's about the right people for the right jobs. And it is a problem. If you flip it on its head, then it's discrimination the other way, right? So it becomes in 10, 15, 50 years, however long it takes, we're having a conversation about redressing the balance in men's favour because women have taken over or young people have taken over or whatever it may be.
I think women have taken over in this industry, yeah.
But you see the point. You don't want to tip the scales just to redress the balance. It needs to be fair. It should always be fair.
So I have a slightly different perspective to Michael on this. I absolutely understand the sentiment. And at an individual level, if you feel that you haven't been appointed or you've missed out on that opportunity because you happen to be the wrong identity rather than the right identity, there is a personal sense of grievance that I absolutely empathise with. So I think there's a difference between the individual experience and the strategic imperative. So I'm not sure that middle-aged white men being discriminated against stacks up against a statistic that you were just rolling earlier about 85% of trustee boards being male.
Yep.
And so I'm not sure that statistically, at a strategic level, that is true.
But to be
Was
fair...
the question of the risk, though, rather than...
Well, also, to be fair, it can take 3 to 5 years for trustees to roll off.
Sure.
So sometimes I think particularly within pensions, it takes a while to see the change because but that's assuming that when you then start doing the review of skill sets and requirements, it's more about the board effectiveness and whether or not those board effectiveness studies or reviews are being done in the right way by the right people.
By the right people.
It's back to boxes again, though. I don't think you can't pigeonhole people and say just because. But it was it's a cultural thing, right? This was the culture of the industry that means that the composition is what it is today, and that will change because people, I think, their mindsets are shifting slightly and realizing that cognitive diversity is incredibly important. So things will change, but it shouldn't be at to the detriment of men or women or whichever.
And I suppose my one variant on that is I'm less of a skeptic about positive discrimination. I think positive discrimination is sometimes misunderstood. My view about positive discrimination is in the event that you are making an appointment where you have equally qualified appointable candidates, you can make a strategic decision to appoint somebody who is different to the rest of the board than someone who is the same.
Yeah.
And that is what I believe positive discrimination is about. And it enables firms to make the kind of strategic changes that need to happen without being at risk of being charged with discrimination. And that's a really important and subtle difference. Positive action is not discrimination.
And I think, so we're going to run out of time soon, so there's so many questions. I apologise we haven't got through all of them. But I think what's really coming through as well is that there seems to be a desire to make change. There seems to be a significant lack of understanding about how to sometimes go about making that change, or to take others with you on the change. So potentially there's one voice in the room, but how do you go about actually making practical changes? I noticed someone's actually asked a question about dealing with stagnant inward-focused culture, probably knowing where I work. It is definitely a problem. I do work in an industry that does need to make some cultural changes, but it's going to take a long time. And I think that it all comes down to, I think everyone's saying, it comes down to the people. Bottom up, top down, it comes down to managers, making sure that they're aware of diversity and are they making decisions in the right way. But also, everybody is coming back to metrics. There has to be a way in which to measure. So therefore, on the note of the fact that we're running out of time, if you had to have one practical thing that you could leave the audience with about diversity and how to potentially make a change or think about things, I'll go down each one of you. What do you think that practical piece of advice you could give? Alison?
It would be think about how do you know if you're asking the right questions? And then, of course, you have to be able to listen to the answers. But are you asking the right questions of people that are not necessarily in the same sort of circle as you? Are you getting independent? Are you asking independent people for questions? Are you asking external people questions? Are you asking customers? Are you asking them the questions about your organisation and about the culture of your organisation? Because I do think, it's the inclusion. If you have the inclusion, the diversity will follow and will stay, because it isn't just about who you recruit, it's about who you bring up the organisation, who stays with your firm, who you retain. But are you, as non-execs, as managers, as leaders, are you continually challenging your own assumptions by going out and asking questions about how you're perceived, about how your organisation is perceived, about how your employees see you?
I would say take 10 minutes to speak to a person that you would not normally speak to, even just at the conference today. Have a conversation with them, see what commonalities there are, and then roll that forward into the rest of your working lives.
I'm probably in Michael's camp. It's the small things as much as the big things. The big things are important. But I think for me, it would be, don't walk by. Don't walk on by when you see those little things that are corrosive in a culture and think, I haven't got time to address it. I haven't got time to call it out. I haven't got time to inspire a conversation about what is that about and is that okay? I think we are full of firms who have leaders and middle managers who are a bit scared to have the conversation, a bit scared to mark themselves out as troublemakers if they call out certain types of behaviour. And actually, they're only small things, but they signal a huge amount. So be brave.
Alison, can I just add one thing, which is just that we've talked here about the firm, but also there is the sector. And it's thinking, this is the firm, but collectively as a sector, how do we make this a really, really exciting sector for talent from across the piece to be in? And how as the sector do we sort of tip that norm and tip the perceptions, which is what carries other firms with it? So what's the collective challenge as well as the individual challenge?
And so just before we go to a coffee break, I know that this is a very passionate subject for lots of different people. I just wanted to check if there's anyone in the room that had a comment or a quick question that they wanted to particularly ask. I don't want to stop you from going to your coffee, but in the spirit of being open and inclusive, no? Lots of people obviously have asked questions. One at the back there. Sorry.
Thank you. I'd just like to pick up on a point that Debbie made, I think, at the end about positive action, but also tie it back into the remark about the civil service. It would appear that what the civil service did, from the information we were given, was that they didn't ask the right question, in as much as they have changed some of the identities of the people they have been recruiting, but because they're still taking people from a small strand, Russell Group, highly qualified graduates, they will not be getting the diversity of thought or cognitive approach, because they haven't, it's the point that you're trying to make about asking the right question. They haven't looked at what they needed to broaden or change within the organisation. They've simply looked at changing some of the identities. And I quite agree that positive action is quite legal and at times needs to be done, because the organisation does need to see some change. But it looks like the danger there is that that's all they've done. They've looked at one aspect of it, and they're not going to get the change in behaviour, and they're not going to get the change in culture, because they're not asking the right question. I think it comes back to, what do we need to ask, and what do we need to change in terms of the culture to get a change of behaviour?
I don't have an answer to the question, but I wholeheartedly agree with you. And it was the point I was making earlier, that identity and demographics becomes an outcome in itself rather than the indicator of something much more deep and more difficult.
Perfect. Well, on that note, thank you very much to the panel, and please do join us for some coffee in the exhibition hall.